On May 29, 1453, a scholar reportedly scratched ink onto parchment, outlining the precise moment a soul leaves the body. Outside his cell, Constantinople, the most heavily fortified city on earth, was being torn apart. Screams echoed. Cannons roared. He didn't look up, even as shadows fell across his door. He already knew what was coming. The official histories say a young sultan, cannons, and sheer numbers brought down this impossible city. They're wrong. The real story is darker, far more unsettling. It's about a sickness of the soul, a city so consumed by its own prophecies that it walked willingly into the grave. What happens when the stories you tell yourself to feel safe are actually the blueprint for your own destruction? And what does that say about the stories you believe in today? To understand what is about to unfold, you need to picture the city not as the ruins you've seen in photographs, but as it was then, a living, breathing metropolis of impossible grandeur. This was Constantinople, the queen of cities, founded in 330 AD by Emperor Constantine the Great as the New Rome. For more than 1,000 years, it was the heart of the Byzantine Empire, the continuation of Roman power in the East. Its defenses were the stuff of legend. The Theodosian walls, a triple-layered system of fortifications stretching approximately 4 miles across the landward side, were considered utterly impenetrable. They had withstood attacks from Avars, Persians, Arabs, and Bulgars. Inside these walls was a civilization that preserved the knowledge of ancient Greece and Rome, while the West languished in the Dark Ages. You could walk through streets paved with marble, gaze up at the gilded dome of the Hagia Sophia, and smell the exotic spices pouring into the port from the Silk Road. But this empire was a shadow of its former self. By the mid-15th century, the Byzantine world had shrunk to little more than the city itself and a few scattered territories. It was an empire of memory, haunted by its own glorious past. And across the Bosporus Strait, a new power was rising, young, hungry, and armed with a technology that would change the world forever. The Ottoman Turks, led by the brilliant and ruthless 21-year-old Sultan Mehmed II. He had one singular, all-consuming ambition, an obsession inherited from his father, to conquer Constantinople and make it the crown jewel of his own burgeoning empire. He believed it was his destiny, a destiny foretold in his own faith. The Byzantines, meanwhile, were crippled by internal division. A deep, bitter schism had torn them away from the Catholic West in 1054, a wound that refused to heal. They were isolated, bankrupt, and vastly outnumbered. The last Roman emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, took the throne in 1449, a capable and brave leader ruling over a city that was already dying from within. The stage was set for a final, cataclysmic confrontation between the old world and the new, between faith and gunpowder, between an empire that remembered everything and a sultan who would forget nothing. What you need to understand is that the people inside those walls didn't just see an army at their gates. They saw the fulfillment of a story they had been telling themselves for centuries. The dread did not begin with the first cannon shot. It began with the sound of hammers. In the summer of 1452, Sultan Mehmed II ordered the construction of a fortress on the European side of the Bosporus, just a few miles north of Constantinople. It was called Rumeli Hisara, or the Throat Cutter. It was built in a breathtaking 4 months, directly opposite an existing Ottoman fortress on the Asian side, giving the Sultan complete control of the strait and strangling the city's access to Black Sea trade and reinforcements. Every Byzantine ship that tried to pass was reportedly blasted out of the water. If you had been a fisherman on the Golden Horn, you would have watched this stone monster rise on the horizon day by day, and you would have known it was a declaration of war. The Emperor, Constantine XI, sent desperate pleas to the West, to the Pope in Rome, to the merchants of Venice and Genoa. He begged for soldiers, for ships, for money, but the response was tepid. The West demanded a price for its aid, the reunification of the Orthodox and Catholic churches, a submission to the authority of the Pope. For the fiercely independent Orthodox Byzantines, this was an unthinkable betrayal of their faith, a spiritual poison. The debate raged within the city walls, a bitter civil war of words while a real army was gathering outside. But the true turning point would come from an unexpected visitor. Then came the engineer. A Hungarian master craftsman named Urban arrived in Constantinople in 1452, offering his services to the emperor. He was a genius in the art of casting bronze cannons, larger and more powerful than any the world had seen. but the Byzantine treasury was empty. Constantine XI could not afford Urban's price. So Urban did what any good contractor would do. He crossed the strait and offered his services to the other side. Mehmed II welcomed him with open arms, asking him one question. Could he build a cannon that could shatter the walls of Babylon itself? Urban promised he could. The result was the basilic, a monstrous 27-foot-long cannon that required 60 oxen to move and could fire a 200-pound stone ball over a mile. It was one of over 60 cannons in Mehmed's siege train. The sound of its test firing could be heard for 100 miles. Inside the city, the signs of doom began to multiply, feeding a growing panic. In the days before the siege began, a lunar eclipse cast the moon in a blood-red light, a terrifying omen the citizens interpreted as a sign of the city's fall. A few days later, a thick, unseasonable fog reportedly blanketed Constantinople for days, a phenomenon some believed no one had ever witnessed. When it finally lifted, witnesses swore they saw a strange, fiery light flickering around the dome of the Hagia Sophia, which they believed was the Holy Spirit abandoning the city. These weren't just weather events to the people of Constantinople. If you were living there, these were divine messages. They were God turning his back on them. The city's defenders numbered fewer than 7,000 men, a mix of Byzantines, Venetians, and a contingent of 700 elite professional soldiers from Genoa, led by the soldier of fortune Giovanni Giustiniani Longo. They were to face an Ottoman army estimated at over 80,000, including the fanatical elite infantry, the Janissaries. On April 2, 1453, the vast Ottoman army appeared before the Theodosian walls. The siege began. For weeks, Urban's great cannons hammered the ancient stones day and night, the constant, earth-shaking concussions turning the very ground to mud. The defenders worked tirelessly, repairing the breaches with earth and timber under the cover of darkness. Giustiniani's leadership was brilliant, repelling every Ottoman assault. For a moment, it seemed the impossible might happen. A small fleet of Genoese ships managed to break through the Ottoman naval blockade, bringing much-needed supplies and a surge of morale. But Mehmed was relentless. In a feat of logistical genius, he bypassed the great chain protecting the city's harbor, the Golden Horn. He ordered his men to construct a greased log road over the hills of Galata, and in a single night, they dragged 70 of his ships overland and into the harbor, outflanking the city's naval defenses. Here is the detail that would have made your blood run cold if you were on those walls. You would have woken up one morning to find an enemy fleet in the one place you believed was perfectly safe. The psychological blow was devastating. The siege tightened. Food ran short. The constant bombardment frayed every nerve. And all the while, the old stories, the dark prophecies that had lurked in the city's subconscious for 1,000 years, began to surface with deadly force. The worst part hadn't happened yet. The true breaking point did not happen at the walls. It happened in the heart. As the siege wore on, the emperor's desperate pleas for unity became more frantic. He knew that a city divided against itself could not stand. He formally proclaimed the union of the Eastern and Western churches in a solemn ceremony at the Hagia Sophia, hoping it would placate the Latins in the city and convince the Pope to send a relief fleet. The reaction from his own people was not relief, but venomous rage. The Orthodox faithful, led by the scholar Gennadius Scholarius, who you met at the beginning of our story, saw this as the ultimate act of heresy. They boycotted the great cathedral, declaring it polluted. They held their own services in other churches, praying not for deliverance, but for divine punishment against their own leaders. It was in this moment of supreme crisis that the Grand Duke Lucas Notaras, the highest-ranking official in the empire after the emperor himself, reportedly uttered words that would seal the city's fate. In a public tirade against the union with Rome, he is often quoted as saying he would rather see the Sultan's turban in the midst of the city than the Latin mitre. Think about the person you trust most in the world, a partner in a desperate struggle for survival. Now imagine them looking you in the eye and saying they would rather surrender to the enemy at the gate than accept help from an ally they despised. This statement was not just political posturing. It was the voice of a civilization choosing death over compromise. It was the moment the soul of the city fractured completely. The defenders on the walls were now fighting for leaders their own people had damned as heretics. The will to resist, the spiritual certainty that had sustained Constantinople for a millennium, was gone, replaced by a bitter, suicidal pride. The city had turned its weapons on itself.
And here is what should make you deeply uncomfortable. This fatalism was not chaos.
It was a system. Ancient prophecies, which had been whispers for centuries, now became the city's unofficial military doctrine. One of the most powerful was the belief that Constantinople could never truly fall because at the final, desperate moment, an angel would descend from heaven, sword in hand, and annihilate the invading army.
This wasn't just a comforting bedtime story. People believed it with the certainty of a physical law.
As a result, military commanders, and perhaps even the emperor himself, were influenced to hold back their final reserves, waiting for a divine intervention that was never going to come. They were conserving their strength for a miracle. Another, even more specific prophecy created a terrifying sense of inevitability. An old oracle stated that the city would fall when an emperor named Constantine, whose mother was named Helen, sat on the throne. The city's founder was Constantine the Great, son of Saint Helena. The last emperor was Constantine XI, son of Helena Dragash. The symmetry was perfect, and for the Byzantines it was inescapable. It felt like the closing of a divine circle, a story written in the stars at the city's birth, now reaching its foreordained conclusion. You can see how this changes everything. The defenders were not just fighting an army of men, they were fighting against what they believed to be the will of God himself. Their struggle was not to win, but to play their part in a tragedy that had already been written. And this belief system had a physical, tactical consequence. It created paralysis. It fostered inaction. It turned strategic decisions into acts of faith. The prophecies were no longer just stories. They had become a self-fulfilling engine of destruction, guiding the city's hand towards the very doom they described. But none of that prepared anyone for the most chilling prediction of all, one that was not written in a dusty scroll, but was allegedly carved into the stone of the city's own founding monument, foretelling a specific tiny detail of the final breach. The legend, recorded by later historians, was that an inscription on the equestrian statue of the city's founder, Constantine the Great, contained the final, terrible secret. It spoke of the final Constantine, the son of a Helen, and mentioned the invaders would not triumph through the great land walls, which had always held, but would find their way in through an unlocked postern gate, a small, insignificant door. What you now understand, and what most people never will, is that the fall of Constantinople was not just a military defeat. It was the ultimate act of confirmation bias. For 53 days, the Byzantines endured the most ferocious artillery bombardment in history. They repelled wave after wave of assaults. They held the line. But in the final hours, in the pre-dawn darkness of May 29, 1453, something happened that fit the prophecy perfectly. During the chaos of the final, all-out Ottoman assault, a small contingent of Turkish soldiers reportedly discovered that a tiny gate in the northern section of the walls, the Kirkoporta, had been left unlocked. Some accounts say it was left open by retreating Genoese soldiers. Others claim it was a terrible accident. Whatever the reason, the invaders poured through. They scaled the inner wall and raised the Ottoman standard on a tower. The sight of the enemy flag flying inside the city, in a place it should never have been, shattered the morale of the remaining defenders. The cry went up, "The city is taken!" Panic routed the defense. The system collapsed. The prophecy was fulfilled. This wasn't about the Sultan's cannons anymore. This was about the terrifying power of a narrative. A 1,000-year-old story about a small, unlocked door became the psychological weapon that ultimately broke the will of an empire. The real horror is not that a gate was left unlocked. The horror is that the city had been waiting for it. The pattern is timeless. Societies become so invested in the stories they tell about themselves, about their destiny, their invincibility, or their victimhood, that they become blind to the reality in front of them. They interpret every event, every coincidence, every setback as proof that the story is true. The prophecy doesn't predict the future, it creates it. This is still happening. You see it every day in the political echo chambers and the conspiracy theories that grip the modern world, where belief in a narrative becomes more important than observable fact. The Byzantines weren't stupid or weak. They were trapped by a story so powerful it felt more real than stone walls. The answer to the question you've been sitting with this entire video is this. The great city of Constantinople did not fall because of a cannon. It did not fall because it was outnumbered. It fell because for 1,000 years it had been telling itself a story about how it would die. And when the time came, it followed the script.
The prophecies were not a warning. They were a roadmap to ruin.
The lunar eclipse, the fog, the name of the final emperor, the unlocked gate. Each event was seen not as a random occurrence or a tactical problem to be solved, but as another chapter in a pre-written book of doom. They were so busy looking for signs of their end that they failed to see the opportunities for their survival. The city's greatest strength, its immense history and deep-seated faith, became its fatal weakness. It died not from a failure of its walls, but from a failure of its imagination. It could no longer imagine a future different from the one it had prophesied. The monk's cell is no longer cold. It is filled with the heat of the burning city and the shouting of foreign soldiers in the hallways. Gennadius Scholarius puts down his quill. The treatise is finished. The soul of Constantinople has departed its body. He is now a prisoner in a city that no longer exists.
The next time you find yourself utterly convinced of a particular outcome, caught in an echo chamber of belief that reassures you that you know exactly how the story ends, remember the prophecies that haunted the Queen of Cities. Remember that the story you tell yourself about the world dictates how you act within it.
And sometimes, the most dangerous prophecy is the one you believe in the most.
Tell me in the comments, which part of this stayed with you?